not do that, but just thought I would mention that briefly. And as we do talk about the issue of guns, we're finding out that in the aftermath of the Parkland shooting, that there have been a lot of people that have been lying to, in this case, Senator Marco Rubio, senator from Florida. So we'll get into that a little bit later, but also wanted to cover a story that we've talked about before with Kelly Shackelford, and that is his organization has represented this synagogue. And I use the word synagogue advisedly because basically the synagogue is a 3,500 square foot house in North Dallas. And there has been a dispute that has taken place for years and years. And so there was a very interesting commentary that places their tongue in cheek a little bit about how horrible it is that this synagogue actually wants to have religious services in a community and how it doesn't have enough parking. Again, I might just mention, if you're an Orthodox Jew, you don't need parking because you walk to the synagogue. And so anyway, we'll have a little bit of fun with that. I'll look at satire, and that will be a good warm-up for what we'll talk about a little bit later in the next hour. We'll have Kyle Mann with us, who is with a group called Babylonian Bee. And the Babylon Bee is a group that we will get into more detail with later. Kristina Rasmussen, by the way, will also be with us as we talk about welfare reform in the next hour. And then we'll have Steve Moore with us in the third hour talking about the oil prices and OPEC ceasing to exist in terms of the influence it might have in the United States. Well, it still exists, but it certainly will not have the kind of influence it's had in the past. So those are a few things we can talk about. Of course, we can get into whether or not the Boy Scouts are just now scouts, no longer boys. We've posted some articles about Ted Cruz has an idea on how to work around the filibuster. There is a very good piece that came out today by Robert Knight about giving Donald Trump his due in terms of accomplishments. And at least one or two federal judges have been very questioning the actions and the tactics of Robert Mueller in the investigation. And so that should keep us busy for quite some time. But let me, if I can, for just a few minutes, spend some time talking about a couple of these very important issues, because when we talk about, first of all, what happened with the NRA, that has been certainly an issue. And then, of course, the speech by the president. But the New York Times covered it this way, and they said, in a carpeted sea of guns, we have individuals that were actually coming across various individuals. And one they talk about is Charlie Harwood, who actually is a retired engineer. And he came up to Donald Trump Jr., who I suspect probably was a little more easy to approach than Donald Trump, the president, and said, I don't know how your family puts up with this. And it says the encounter, while brief, managed to capture, he said, the prevailing spirit of the four-day convention, which drew roughly 75,000 attendees to Dallas across the United States. That number will be an interesting one to look at, because one of the people I ran into at the at the NRA, the National Rifle Association convention, was Colonel Allen West. Matter of fact, I ran into him at the beginning of the convention and at the end of it again. When I saw him at the end, since he is a board member of the NRA, and also, by the way, will be a guest host on this program next Friday, a week from this Friday, he said that there was some indication that this particular convention may actually set a record. The all-time record for an NRA convention, I believe, was 83,000 in Houston. They were expecting about 80,000 this time, but if they get even more than 83,000, then this will be an interesting signal that even while this is an organization that has been criticized tremendously over this last year because of the Parkland shooting, there's still a lot of people that want to attend the convention and are proud to say that they're NRA members. Now, what I thought was so interesting is to give them credit. The New York Times, and this is written by Manny Fernandez, took the time to interview a few individuals, and I thought I'd give you a summary of two of those people that were interviewed. One is a woman by the name of Ashley Suris. She's an NRA member, part of the Assistant National Program Director for the Well-Armed Women Shooting Chapters, age 28, from Cleburne, Texas. She said, it does seem like the NRA as a whole and the members are a bit under attack. We're an incredibly law-abiding group, yet it seems that the Connecticut governor called NRA members terrorists. She said, I think gun owners know that our rights are under attack and at risk, so we all have a fire in our bellies to get involved and get more vocal. She went on to say, it's nice to be among other gun owners and know that when I'm asked the question of what do I do for a living, I don't have to skirt around the fact that I'm in guns, because I know everybody here is welcoming and supportive. So again, maybe we can get her on sometime, or the Well-Armed Woman Shooting Chapters. And she lives in Cleburne, Texas, age 28. One of the other people they interviewed was Alice Tripp. On the other end, 71 years of age, from Page, Texas, but also is a legislative director of the Texas State Rifle Association. And Alice said, we're not here circling the wagons, surrounding the fort. We don't do that. It's not political. These are set up 5 to 10 years in advance. I got my hotel reservations a year ago, she said. People got their reservations before Sutherland Springs. Of course, that was a shooting here in Texas, before Parkland, and before Las Vegas. Those things are criminal activities. We're not criminals. And so Alice says Columbine was in April of 1999. The NRA annual convention was in Denver in May. The mayor of Denver said, we don't want you here. Well, it's an annual meeting. It's part of the requirement because of the nonprofit status. The NRA canceled the exhibit hall completely, but they had the meeting. Marion Hammer was the first woman president of the NRA, and she was president. I know her. I was close to her. She had a bodyguard. The picketers were vile, and that's scary. She said, this is nothing. When I went there, there were some brief protests out in front of City Hall, but by and large, any maybe stories you saw about protesters were in very isolated locations, and certainly not indicative of the people in the convention. So, if nothing else, the NRA convention came to Dallas and has left, and certainly seems to be doing fairly well. The president, of course, spoke to the NRA convention, and after the break, I'll just give you kind of 4 points that Fred Lucas summarized from some of the things the president had to say, and then I want to move on to something that has been kind of intriguing. And that is, are we going to continue to fight with this little synagogue? And I do mean little. It's just actually in a house, because it doesn't have parking for people that don't use cars, and because they say there's a couple of other things that need to take the house up to code, and we'll see. But nevertheless, even the Dallas Morning News said, at least in this particular editorial piece that came out by Robert Wolonsky, that this is a bit much, given the fact that these are just a few Orthodox Jews just want a place to worship, and have had this ongoing battle, first with the homeowners, then with the city of Dallas, and now with all sorts of other individuals. We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, the crime rate is up in many cities, so maybe it's time to consider a solution rarely suggested. Let's see what faith-based organizations and people of faith can do. The evidence is that it can reduce the crime rate and the recidivism rate in our prisons. This is the argument Baylor University criminologist Byron Johnson makes in his book, More God, Less Crime. Sadly, most social scientists and even criminologists seem reluctant to make the connection between faith and the impact religious perspectives could have on America's crime problem. Dr. Johnson believes that a faith-based ministry or message doesn't resonate with most social scientists. Many are even hostile to religion, as demonstrated by the opening chapter in his book entitled The Last Acceptable Prejudice. Dr. Johnson also says that faith-based organizations were merely tolerated within the criminal justice system. In some places, they're seen as valuable and even helpful. In other jurisdictions, they're viewed with suspicion. This is unfortunate, since the criminal justice system is facing cutbacks and shrinking budgets. Prison ministries like Bill Glass, Prison Fellowship, and Kairos Prison Ministry can provide people and programs that can make a difference. Faith-based organizations of all kinds can provide volunteers and educators to help with programs in life skills and adult education. The book is full of positive examples of what can happen when Christians get involved in their local community. He tells the story of the Boston Miracle, where police and pastors worked together to break the stranglehold gangs had in the community. He also talks about the mission of the Center for Neighborhood Enterprise and Violence-Free Zones. He even gives practical advice on the important issues of prisoner reentry and aftercare. Most importantly, he provides a review of the literature so that churches and faith-based organizations can show skeptics that the title of the book is true. More God, Less Crime. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. If you're an NRA supporter or even a detractor, I'd love to hear from you as well. And, of course, you can also go to our Facebook Live post, and I'll be reading some of those comments a little bit later. You can watch the program or, of course, just leave a comment. Or if you'd like to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. The president did speak at the National Rifle Association convention. So did the vice president. So did two United States senators, John Cornyn and Ted Cruz. So did, of course, all the leadership of the NRA, and so we could certainly spend all of our time talking about their speeches. I won't, but I thought I would just mention 4 points that Fred Lucas mentions, 4 takeaways from Donald Trump's NRA speech, if for no other reason than the fact that there is a lot of coverage of Stormy Daniels these days, but not a lot of coverage about what the president has to say. And as much as you agree or disagree with whether or not the press should cover Stormy Daniels, what is going to affect you and your family, your faith, your family, and your freedom, which is kind of the theme here of Point of View, are some of the things that the president says, some of the things that the president does, some of the things that Congress does, and some of the legislation that is passed or not. So I like to sometimes focus on things that are going to make a real difference in your life. Well, he had 4 major topics that he set forth, and the first one was the issue of school safety and the Second Amendment. As Fred Lucas puts it here, after the Florida shooting, Democrats and many youth groups turned up the pressure to enact new gun legislation. But as you might imagine, the president, in more of a sarcastic way, said, it seems that if we're going to outlaw guns, like so many people want to do, Democrats, we're going to have to outlaw immediately all vans and all trucks, which is now the new form of death for the maniac terrorist. They'll take a truck and run over people, so let's ban immediately all trucks, all vans, maybe all cars. How about cars? Let's not sell any more cars. Part of that actually got repeated by some of the mainstream press, but a lot of it got left on. Went on to talk about how teachers many times will be willing to arm themselves, but not all will. But teachers certainly love their students and would want to do all they can to protect them. So that's his first point. Then, apart from the gun issue, he spent some time talking about securing the border. He attacked, again, some in Congress for opposing the closing of loopholes for illegal immigrants. Also talked about this policy as basically catch and release, which we've talked about before. And then also the fact that he wanted to withhold federal funds from sanctuary cities and also to allow victims of violent crimes or their families to be able to hold sanctuary cities liable. So those were a couple of pieces. He spent some time talking about the MS-13 gangs and a variety of other, but that was a second point, in addition to guns, talking about the issue of the border. Number 3, he talked about creating new jobs, and in the midst of that, talked about Kanye West. You had to see that coming sometime. He talked about the 3 million new jobs created since his election, along with the falling unemployment numbers. We did talk about that on Friday, 3.9% unemployment. When we have Steve Moore with us on the third hour, Steve Moore will, I'm sure, get into that as we also talk about the issue of OPEC and the incredible amount of oil production taking place here. But nevertheless, he talked about that as well. And then talked about, even for the African-American community, unemployment had reached an all-time low since his administration, which, of course, you knew it was coming. Pivoted then, of course, to talking about one of his more well-known and controversial supporters, Kanye West. He said, by the way, Kanye West must have some power because you probably saw I doubled my African-American poll numbers. Maybe not, but nevertheless, you had to put that one in here. And then finally, number 4, his fourth point in his message was about the courts and the Constitution, something we've talked about here as well. Took credit for the rapid pace of naming appeals court judges to the bench, referring to how many vacancies were still left to fill. But as we pointed out at the end of this last year, the president actually set a record which surprises all of us, given some of the hostility to the president and given the fact that Democrats still can block a lot of things in the United States Senate. And because if you are going to be appointed to the Supreme Court, to the appeals court, or to the district court, there is the advice and consent to procedure, but nevertheless actually had more individuals appointed to the circuit courts than any president in history. Broke the record that was set by John F. Kennedy and by Richard Nixon. And then he also went on to say, we need judges who will enforce our laws, protect our sovereignty, uphold our American way of life. A little bit later, he said the Constitution can't be changed by judges, bureaucrats, or the United Nations. That is why we are appointing federal judges who will interpret the law as written. So you probably didn't hear much about the president's speech at the NRA convention. Some of it had to do with guns. A lot of it had to do with just other issues that we talk about here on Point of View, and I thought you'd like to know that as well. Let me get on to another Dallas story, and that has to do with this congregation, Torres Chaim, which is a synagogue. It actually is located kind of near Frankfurt and Hillcrest. I love what Robert Wolonsky says. As far as the Collin County Appraisal District is concerned, it should be Plano, but it's listed as Dallas. But anyway, he says, if the name rings a bell, you are clearly a close reader of news stories involving Orthodox Jewish houses of worship, neighborhood deed restrictions, city codes, and lawsuits. This story is now entering its 5th year. Can you believe this poor congregation has been dealing with these lawsuits for 5 years? And he says, as of Thursday, we're on our 3rd religious liberty lawsuit involving the little synagogue that could or couldn't. I guess we'll see what the judge has to say. He says Torres Chaim is a congregation no larger than 25 members and was in the news quite a bit beginning in March of 2014 when a man living across the street from the synagogue sued to keep the Highlands of McCamey neighborhood residential. Long story short, this individual, tired of having cars parked in front of his house, took Rabbi Rich and his congregants to court. But a judge wasn't having it, ruling the enclave's deed restrictions violated state and federal laws meant to actually keep the government from prohibiting religious worship. That could have and should have been that, given the coming tenor of the ongoing tussle. But on the beginning of March 2015, the city of Dallas filed its own suit, insisting that Torres Chaim was operating without a certificate of occupancy necessary whenever someone tries to convert a house into a non-residential use. The city said the synagogue lacked an adequate number of parking spots, wasn't accessible to the disabled, and might not have been safe in case of a fire. In turn, the synagogue's attorneys, and those would be our friends from First Liberty Institute, actually began to talk about the fact that Dallas was trying to inhibit its right to freely exercise its religious faith and simply using zoning laws to try to push them out. Thus began, as the commentator here says, the ongoing holy war during which someone painted a swastika on Rabbi Rich's Honda, and I've got a picture of it here, and it's something you can find at First Liberty Institute as well. A mezuzah was pulled off the synagogue's door frame, and even at that point, the Christian Broadcasting Network began to weigh in. But nevertheless, in a statement released after his car was vandalized, Rabbi Rich said he felt completely violated, and he said, they didn't just attack me, they attacked every Jew in the city of Dallas. So the city attorneys in this article said they've maintained this isn't personal because the city of Dallas, you can have a house of worship pretty much anywhere in a residential neighborhood, on top of an office park, next door to a strip club, you name it. But they said that this was simply a zoning issue. And if nothing else, two of the several assistant city attorneys who worked the case said that it is in the process of pulling permits and making alterations necessary to get the house up to code, but that it takes time and the synagogue adds lots of money and nothing's done, which is why in part the Dallas County lawsuit was paused in January. According to court records, there were negotiations going on. But now there's a new suit. This would now be the third if you're not counting. There was the individual that filed a suit. There is Dallas that's filed a suit. Now Cullen County has filed a suit over parking. And as again, one of the things Robert Wolanski, the columnist, says is over 6 whole parking spots. He says, I kid you not. 2 weeks ago, representatives from the synagogue, including new attorneys from another law firm, went to Dallas City Hall to make their case for the fourth time that Torres Chaim qualified for an exemption from the city's off-street parking rules. In this case, the city says that the house of worship needs a dozen off-street parking spots. It only has 6, and they really wanted the other 6 to slide. But nevertheless, the argument being made right now by Rabbi Rich, what I think makes some sense is that you can imagine in a neighborhood where maybe somebody has a book club, a Bible study, even a poker game. Sometimes there are more cars than 6 parking spaces right there, and nobody makes a fuss. Why on a Saturday when they meet for synagogue is this such a big issue? But nevertheless, that's the issue right now that they are having to fight with another lawsuit. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Does point of view make any difference? I think Dr. Eric Walsh would say it does. Dr. Walsh was fired from his job as district health director for the state of Georgia, not because of anything he did or failed to do on the job, but because of sermons he preached in his local church. What does that have to do with point of view? Jeremy Dyes of First Liberty represented Dr. Walsh, and in February, the state of Georgia paid a large settlement for their religious discrimination. And Jeremy Dyes became an attorney specializing in defending religious liberty greatly because of what he learned listening to Point of View Radio as a child. That is the kind of difference you make when you support the Truth Team, but we can't make that difference without your help. Become a partner today in this important mission of speaking truth in love. Join the Truth Team at pointofview.net/team. Choose your giving level, stretch a bit, and please do it today. Or call 800-347-5151. pointofview.net/team. Or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me, for just a few minutes, focus some time and attention on government malfeasance, lying or deception. All of that fits into this category. And the first has to do with a piece that came out by Alan Dershowitz. Now, Alan Dershowitz has been on the program a couple of times, an individual who would, by definition, call himself a liberal, a progressive, has been a professor at Harvard University, and yet it is interesting because just recently I was talking with somebody who had had him come into town to speak. And as the former professor of law at Harvard Law School and the author of all sorts of books that and various opinions that support things like the ACLU and liberal causes, he's become kind of a persona non grata among his liberal friends because he's been willing to say, we are the ones that support the rule of law. We oftentimes are very critical of individuals that are using the courts to prosecute people, or that are in many cases using government apparatus to persecute individuals. And as a result, a lot of people that normally would be his friends are upset because what he's been saying lately is something that seems to support the Trump administration, which it really doesn't, but is certainly critical of the people going after the Trump administration. That will help you understand this particular piece that appeared in The Hill. The Hill is the kind of journal of record for Capitol Hill. And Alan Dershowitz said, an experienced federal judge has confirmed what I've been arguing for months, namely the modus operandi of special counsel Robert Mueller is to charge associates of President Trump with any crime they can find in order to squeeze them into turning against Trump. Now, that's a technique that's been used in the past, but first of all, who is he quoting? Well, he's quoting T.S. Ellis. We mentioned him briefly on Friday, but let's get into a little bit more detail. He's a judge that was put on the courts, interestingly enough, by Ronald Reagan. And he said in a hearing on Friday, quote, and he's saying this now to some of the people associated with the Mueller investigation, quote, you don't really care about Mr. Manafort's bank fraud. What you really care about is what information Manafort could give you that would reflect on Mr. Trump and lead to his prosecution or impeachment, unquote. And I love what Alan Dershowitz says. He's got a Jewish background. He said, this is a tactic as old as Adam turning against Eve. But as the judge correctly points out, it risks the possibility that the squeezed witness will not only sing, he will compose. See, this is the problem, because the idea here is that let's go after some individuals. Michael Flynn, perfect example. Individual's been on the program with us, then actually decided to plead to a charge that's, I guess even Alan Dershowitz calls it highly questionable. But he says that the problem with this tactic is when you threaten a witness, the crimes that they are, he says, are charged with are often highly technical, elastic charges that are brought only as leverage, and sometimes they're dropped as soon as the witness cooperates. And so he makes the point that whether we're looking at the situation here with Manafort, or whether we're looking at the situation with Michael Flynn, or the attorney for President Donald Trump, Michael Cohen, this is a technique that could be used. But here, as a civil libertarian, Alan Dershowitz says civil libertarians have long criticized this tactic since the time it was used by Senator Joseph McCarthy and his minions to pressure witnesses to testify against suspected communists in the 1950s. He said in recent decades it's been deployed against mobsters, terrorists, and corporate predators, but Judge Ellis actually has accused Mueller of using this questionable tactic and approach to develop a political case against the duly elected president of the United States. So pretty critical of the particular procedure being used by Robert Mueller. And if that's not enough, we may get into this a little bit more in detail tomorrow. This actually, when I print it out, takes 17 pages, so I'm not even going to try to cover it now. But an article by, again, somebody we've had on this program, Andrew McCarthy, who's been a federal prosecutor. It's entitled Outrageous Redactions to the Russia Report. That is, when the Justice Department provides some of this material, for example, to members of Congress or any particular other group, or maybe even make some of it available to the general public, there are redactions. Now, the argument is that sometimes we have to redact certain information in a memo, in a correspondence, because it might threaten national security. Well, as Andrew McCarthy points out, these redactions were not done in order to protect individuals that might be various witnesses, sources of information, or to protect national security. This was done to actually show and try to hide from the public all the malfeasance, about a better word, criminal activity in some cases by members of the Justice Department. And so, again, this has been one of the concerns here, because eventually when some of that was revealed, there has been an understanding that some of these redactions were actually showing some of the, if you will, investigative irregularities of what many people would refer to as the deep state. So there is a lot more where this comes from, and it is an illustration, again, that every time somebody says there's no deep state, oh yeah, there's no attempt in the part of the Justice Department to hide any kind of inaccurate, unethical, criminal, even malfeasance. A lot of evidence that indeed that is exactly what has taken place. If that's not enough, I thought just before we take a break, I'll give you one more example of people that just have difficulty telling the truth. And this one comes out from, of all places, Senator Marco Rubio's particular office. And in this particular article, Jennifer Van Laer says that in the aftermath of the Parkland shooting, as members of the press and government officials were looking into the shooter's past behavior for warning signs, a controversial program surfaced, and it's one that I've done a commentary on. Penna Dexter's done a commentary on. It's called PROMISE. What is PROMISE? Well, PROMISE is basically an acronym for Preventing Recidivism through Opportunities, Mentoring, Intervention, Supports, and Education. Okay, this was an attempt to prevent what they call the school-to-prison pipeline. What would happen is that some young people, usually those maybe African-American, sometimes Hispanic-American individuals, would act up in school. The police would be called. The police would then have a record on those individuals, and by the time they would graduate from high school, or in some cases not graduate from high school, these individuals already had a record because of disruptions that took place on campus. And so in a way to sort of effectively address this issue of juvenile crime, they said, we know, we'll let the school take care of some of these disruptions rather than call the police. That way these individuals won't have a record, so they would be less likely to leave school and end up immediately in the prisons. It's sort of like saying, even though they committed a crime, we're not going to call it a crime. We'll let the school take care of it, and so as a result, they won't find themselves behind bars. Well, you can imagine the controversy of that, but here's the key point. Back to Senator Rubio and the Broward officials. Marco Rubio, Senator Rubio, was asked and used by the Broward officials as a target for the public's rage in the weeks after the shooting. For example, you might remember at the CNN town hall, he was booed, he was disrespected by a kid, he was called a murderer at one point, and despite the hate, Rubio sought the truth about what Nicholas Cruz's past and his past interactions with the school officials and law enforcement officials were, in an attempt to see if there were any failures and to prevent them from occurring again. And while he would ask these questions, and while members of his staff would ask these questions, it turns out they were completely lied to. The school district and his officials had zero problems lying to the United States Senator to protect their program. And for those of you that are maybe on Marco Rubio's Twitter feed, you will see what he has posted. It says, quote, I was repeatedly told that the Parkland shooter was never in the PROMISE program. I was asking questions about. It turns out that, in fact, he was. They lied to a United States senator about the Promise Program, and of course we've talked about the Promise Program here on Point of View. Penna Dexter has a commentary on it that you can find at pointofview.net. I have a commentary on it as well. And even though it may have been one of those well-intentioned programs to keep young people out of prison, in some respects it certainly has its flaws. And the biggest one of all, they lied to the senator about whether he was in the program in the first place. Since we're talking about crime, my commentary today is entitled More God, Less Crime. I'll talk about that right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Brian Finnemore is described as a fundamentalist Christian. He worked for a hydroelectric company in Bangor, Maine. Everyone there knew he was a Christian, and that's where the problem seemed to begin. The talk in the garage where Brian worked was often vulgar. His coworkers made explicit, demeaning jokes about their wives. It was more than Brian could stand, and he finally spoke up, questioning how they could carry on in such a manner and explaining that such conversation was offensive to him because of his religious beliefs. You can probably guess what happened next. Brian's coworkers turned their crude jokes on him, targeting Brian's wife instead of their own. He complained to his supervisors, but they took no action. It was too much, so Brian resigned. After he filed a claim of religious discrimination, the lower court granted summary judgment in favor of the company. The Supreme Judicial Court of Maine reversed that decision, explaining that whether a comment is of a religious nature or whether it occurred because of an individual's religious beliefs or would have not occurred but for the individual's religion is a question of fact that a jury should decide. Brian's case is a good reminder that sometimes it takes a jury of one's peers to sort through all the facts in order to defend an employee's religious liberty. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. Let me ask you, what if America's best attorneys from the very top law firms got together to defend religious freedom in court? That's exactly what's happening at First Liberty. And the best news? We're winning over 90% of our legal actions. Come learn more at firstliberty.org. You'll be encouraged. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, let me mention in the second hour today, we're going to have Kyle Mann with the Babylonian Bee, and we're going to be talking about this new book, How to Be a Perfect Christian, which, of course, is a little bit of satire, and so we'll get into that in that next hour. Kristina Rasmussen will be talking about the whole issue of food stamps and welfare reform, and quite a bit in that regard. Steve Moore will be with us in the third hour as we talk about the fact that the United States might actually become energy independent, and his piece, Goodbye OPEC. Pretty amazing indeed. Somewhere along the line, we'll get into another article we've posted here as well about Ted Cruz's 4 ways to work around a filibuster. And, of course, Robert Knight's written about Donald Trump's accomplishments that sometimes never get mentioned. So we'll kind of get into some of those issues. Of course, we just talked about some of these redactions in the Justice Department reports. But just before we wind down this hour, let me just mention that, again, the issue at hand with Senator Marco Rubio is what is called the PROMISE program. PROMISE stands for Preventing Recidivism Through Opportunities, Mentoring, Intervention, Supports, and Education. We started in the Miami-Dade area, and it was adopted in Broward County a couple of years after that. And it was an attempt by the Department of Education under the Obama administration to stop the school-to-prison pipeline. Now, interestingly enough, Peter Kirschenau, who is a member of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, has said that the motivation behind PROMISE and some of these similar programs in other districts wasn't what was actually claimed. Broward County, he argues, was adopted a lenient disciplinary policy similar to those adopted by many other districts under the Obama administration, primarily to reduce what's called racial disparities in suspensions and expulsions. That is, when you had a much higher percentage of African American, Hispanic American students who were suspended or expelled, that did not look good. And so as a result, he says, in many of these districts, the drive to get our numbers right has produced those disastrous results. And so not only has it been Senator Marco Rubio that has expressed concern, one of the other individuals that has gone to Twitter to express concern is a man by the name of Ryan Petty. He is the father of one of the Parkland victims, Elenia Petty. And he's also been writing about the failure of this particular program called PROMISE, and also the concerns about the district's overall failures regarding crime on campus and school safety. And again, you can go to Ryan Petty and follow his Twitter post, but here's a couple of posts that I found. He said, "This is a stunning revelation and one that flies in the face of previous statements. That the district released it on Sunday is all the more concerning." He then goes on a little bit later to say, "However stunning, the focus should not be on any specific program. It's the totality of district failures that must be addressed." How many times have we heard that this shooter, the Parkland shooter, we had many opportunities to see this young man by the name of Nicholas Cruz, who could have been stopped. And how many times, whether it's the FBI, whether it's the district, whether it's the sheriff, whoever it might be, missed opportunities. And so, again, some very important evidence coming out today about lying to the senator about the PROMISE program. My commentary today, by the way, is about crime. And while we talk about that, there is a very interesting book that has come out by the criminologist at Baylor University, Byron Johnson, called More God, Less Crime. And about a year ago, I had a chance to interview him, and then actually have played and decided to post this commentary again, because one of the things he's pointed out is that most social scientists and even criminologists are kind of reluctant to talk about the relationship and the connection between faith and the impact religious perspectives can have on the crime problem. And so Dr. Byron Johnson believes that a faith-based ministry or message is something that is necessary, but for some reason, and I think we know what that is, because a lot of individuals that are in the university are secular-minded individuals, they don't really resonate with a faith-based ministry. So either they don't have an interest in it, or, as he points out, some of them are even hostile to that. He's got a chapter in the book called The Last Acceptable Prejudice. That is, they're allowed to be prejudicial against faith-based organizations because, after all, they're Christian, and what do the Christians have to say about the issue of crime? Well, Dr. Johnson says that faith-based organizations then are merely tolerated, usually within the criminal justice system. Some places they're seen as valuable and more helpful, and we've talked about that on this program with other individuals that have worked with chaplains and worked with various wardens. but in other jurisdictions, they're viewed with suspicion. And, of course, he points out that that's unfortunate because at a time when the criminal justice system is facing cutbacks, and that was the cover page article, I think it was it was the Friday lead article in USA Today. Then at a time when you have cutbacks and shrinking budgets, that's all the more times when I think you'd want to welcome Bill Glass, Prison Fellowship, Kairos Prison Ministry, and all of these others can make a difference. And so, if nothing else, the book is just full of examples of what can happen when Christians get involved in the local community. One of those, he tells the story of what's called the Boston Miracle. And that's where you had police and pastors working together to break the stranglehold that some of these Boston gangs had in their community. And, of course, he also talks about the mission of the Center for Neighborhood Enterprise and violence-free zones, and even gives, I think, some really practical advice on prisoner reentry and aftercare. And so if your church is involved in any kind of prison ministry, let me certainly commend to you the book by Byron Johnson entitled More God, Less Crime. And for those of you that maybe want to write about this, maybe you would like to do a letter to the editor, or like to feature it in a Facebook post, or maybe you're in the academic world right now, or you know somebody that's actually studying criminal justice. There is an incredible kind of review of the literature in the book with some great bibliographies and other material, so that you or your church or your faith-based organization can use that effectively and really, in a sense, be able to show skeptics that the title of the book is true, and that is More God, Less Crime. So, again, just another resource that we wanted to pass on to you. And so after the break, we're going to come back and talk about the Babylon Bee. That, if you have not seen it, is something that shows up with some regularity on my Facebook post, and I suspect maybe it shows up on yours as well. They use a great deal of satire, and so in some respects reminds me of the old days when we had Wittenberg Door, which was a magazine, or even more recently, if you go out online, you'll see things like The Onion. And, of course, because of this, they're making things up. They're making a joke out of it. And a lot of people believe it's true, and so they've actually been investigated more than once by Facebook as providing fake news. Well, no, it's supposed to be a joke, but some people can't take a joke. People sometimes don't even know it is a joke. So we're going to spend some time talking about that with Kyle Mann, and talking about this book, which, again, is Place Your Tongue Firmly in Your Cheek, How to Be a Perfect Christian. Should be a fascinating conversation for about a half an hour. Then we're going to get into the whole issue of welfare reform. Of course, today we've talked a little bit about criminal justice reform. We have a lot to cover, and we will do so. And if you would like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. Visit our website. You're going to find some of the articles here. If you say, okay, I hear what you say, I'm going to have to read it myself. I'm a little skeptical. We encourage you to read them. Check it out for yourself. That's why we post these articles and encourage you to learn a little bit more. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk with Kyle Mann and spend a little bit of time talking about satire in the Christian world. All that coming up right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We're going to spend some time in the first half hour here talking about the Babylon Bee. And if you are ever on Facebook, you've run into this. Matter of fact, our latest post here says this is not really a health concern, but we just want everyone to remember that kale is really gross. And they put out a little satire saying the CDC warns consumers that kale is still disgusting. And of course, it is all satire. We'll talk about that for a little while. A little bit later, we're going to be talking with Kristina Rasmussen about welfare reform. And in the next hour, Steve Moore will be with us as we talk about some very important things having to do with energy. Goodbye, OPEC. And we'll get into some of the news as well. So lots to cover right now. But I thought for just a minute, before we get back into all the news stories that sometimes make our heads explode, we might enjoy this new book that's come out, How to Be a Perfect Christian, Your Comprehensive Guide to Flawless Spiritual Living. That gives you a little bit of idea of the satire involved in the Babylon Bee. And to help us understand the book and some of the things that they post on a regular basis, we bring to the microphone Kyle Mann, who's an author and head writer for the Babylon Bee. Kyle, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, no problem. It's good to be talking to you.
Well, let's get into the Babylon Bee. I would imagine most of our listeners are familiar, but if they aren't and they don't understand satire or they don't have a sense of humor, these are the individuals that then contact Facebook saying, you guys are producing fake news. Now, you're having a lot of fun at the expense sometimes, in this case, the CDZ, most of the time at the expense of churches or Christian organizations. But you've run into a few problems where people don't understand that you're really kind of using this to kind of make fun in a very, I think, sometimes helpful way of Christians in the church, right?
Yeah, there's such a thin line between what fake news is and what satire is that a lot of times people don't pick up on that. And so people will report our stories to Facebook, or they will send it over to Snopes and say, hey, these guys are publishing fake news. And then, one time we even got a warning from Facebook.
Yes, I saw that.
That we were publishing fake news, and they were going to reduce our reach if we kept doing it, which was concerning to us because that's what we do, is publish satire.
Yes. Well, again, I guess maybe we should define satire. I mean, when you look at that historically, we've had satire going all the way back to the ancient world, all the way through the Middle Ages. Some of the more recent books that people might be familiar with, whether it's Catch-22 or Animal House. I mean, you can just go through a very long list, but explain kind of how you and those of you as fellow writers at the Babylon Bee kind of define satire and how you want to apply it to the church.
Yeah, satire is writing something in a fictional or tongue-in-cheek way in order to communicate a larger point about something that is true. So it's humor, but it's humor with a point. It's humor with a purpose. It's humor with a little bit of an edge to it and a little bit of a sting to it. So that's kind of what satire is, we want to make people laugh, and then we want to make people think. And that's opposed to just straight comedy, which is, the entire goal is just to make somebody laugh or make somebody have a chuckle. We want people to laugh and then maybe start to examine their own practices or their own beliefs.
Well, again, this book is published by Multnomah, and we do have information about it on the website. It takes you through, if you will, a whole process of how to become a perfect Christian. And again, Kyle, I got to mention, there have been some Christians in history that have believed in perfectionism, that honestly believe that you could become the perfect Christian. So there are a couple of times when I was reading through this saying, yeah, this is satire, but it's a little close to reality, because it has joining the right church, worshiping like a pro, doing life together, don't you love that phrase, serving the church without ever lifting a finger, looking really spiritual online, striving for personal perfection, conforming to mainstream Christian beliefs, quarantine your house from the worldly wastelands, crusading against the heathens, fighting on the front lines of the culture war, and then finally, congratulations, you've arrived. And so these are attempts, and sometimes not so thinly veiled attempts, to say, you know, there's some Christians that really do kind of believe some of this in terms of how they worship in church, how they pray, and how they even present themselves in social media. Isn't that right?
Yeah. Obviously there were a lot of strains of theology that do believe in perfectionism explicitly. There's like the Wesleyan holiness movement and some other groups that will say, you can be perfect in this life. That's not exactly what we were targeting. Obviously that's kind of something that's not really mainstream. We're targeting people who would not explicitly say that you can be a perfect Christian, and yet in the way that we practice our faith, it is so easy for us to accidentally set up legalistic standards for what you have to do and what you have to avoid in order to have this appearance of perfection within Christian culture.
Well, and a good example of that is that you have lots of fun charts. By the way, there's kind of this holiness progress tracker, which goes through just hilarious stuff in there. But there have a whole section here, and this would be one that I think people could relate to only so well. On the left-hand side here, you've got all the possible things that could befall an individual, from, minor little issues to just major catastrophes. And then on the right-hand side, you tell us what you're supposed to say when you get into church. And the word that you use is fine. My house is blowing up. I'm going to be living in a box, on and on and on. Fine. And I think that's one of those times, Kyle, where you just have to say, if that doesn't describe what we expect out of church, I don't care what you've been through, everything is fine, we're doing great. And when people ask you that, they are. And if you ever have the misfortune of saying to someone, how you doing, and they begin to pour out your life, we learn never to ask that question again, don't we?
Exactly. I mean, that's something you see in wider culture, too, is that we don't really want to get involved with anybody's problems. But especially in church, you notice that people are having fights in the car on the way over, and then they get out of the car, and it's, you tell the welcome team that you're fine. So something we noticed, and that's something we hit big on in this book is, it's okay to not be okay. And that's kind of what we satirize, is a lot of times we feel like we have to project this image that we're doing great and we're following Jesus super close, when sometimes it's like, yeah, you know what, I'm not actually doing what I'm supposed to be doing as a Christian, and I need a lot of help and I need a lot of grace.
Well, another one here is the Christianese, and there's some great YouTube videos out that are not done by you, but by some others that do the same kind of thing. For example, I'll keep you in prayer, brother. The English translation: I have no intention of praying for you. In fact, I've already forgotten what it is that you were going on about. Why are you still talking? Or bless her heart. We are so much holier than that spiritual failure. It's incredible. And so, all the way through, there's just an attempt to kind of say, and maybe we need to back up a little bit, have a little bit more authenticity in our lives. And so I need to take one of those mandatory breaks. When we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Kyle Mann. This book is kind of interesting, because when I first heard that they were going to come out with a book, I figured it would be kind of a best of. But instead, this is actually a book that reads right from front to back. Whether you're familiar with Babylon Bee or not, you will probably enjoy this. A couple of times say, oh, hey, I got to show you this piece, or you're going to want to share a piece, or you want to put a piece maybe in your Twitter post or Facebook post. And, of course, if you're not familiar with Babylon Bee, if nothing else, is a public service, when you see what they post on Facebook, you don't have to believe it, but you certainly can laugh about it. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, the crime rate is up in many cities, so maybe it's time to consider a solution rarely suggested. Let's see what faith-based organizations and people of faith can do. The evidence is that it can reduce the crime rate and the recidivism rate in our prisons. This is the argument Baylor University criminologist Byron Johnson makes in his book, More God, Less Crime. Sadly, most social scientists and even criminologists seem reluctant to make the connection between faith and the impact religious perspectives could have on America's crime problem. Dr. Johnson believes that a faith-based ministry or message doesn't resonate with most social scientists. Many are even hostile to religion, as demonstrated by the opening chapter in his book entitled The Last Acceptable Prejudice. Dr. Johnson also says that faith-based organizations were merely tolerated within the criminal justice system. In some places, they're seen as valuable and even helpful. In other jurisdictions, they're viewed with suspicion. This is unfortunate since the criminal justice system is facing cutbacks and shrinking budgets. Prison ministries like Bill Glass, Prison Fellowship, and Kairos Prison Ministry can provide people and programs that can make a difference. Faith-based organizations of all kinds can provide volunteers and educators to help with programs in life skills and adult education. The book is full of positive examples of what can happen when Christians get involved in their local community. He tells the story of the Boston Miracle, where police and pastors worked together to break the stranglehold gangs had in the community. He also talks about the mission of the Center for Neighborhood Enterprise and Violence-Free Zones. He even gives practical advice on the important issues of prisoner reentry and aftercare. Most importantly, he provides a review of the literature so that churches and faith-based organizations can show skeptics that the title of the book is true. More God, Less Crime. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking for a few more minutes with Kyle Mann, and again, one of the writers with the Babylon Bee, and again, the book is entitled How to Be a Perfect Christian, Your Comprehensive Guide to Flawless Spiritual Living. And Kyle, one of the things that people might think is, okay, you're probably younger, and we do, of course, a Wednesday Millennial Roundtable, and so probably you skewer a lot of these particular churches that have a high church experience, but don't ever go after any of those that maybe have worship leaders or worship bands. But no, you are an equal opportunity grief giver, aren't you?
Oh, absolutely. And it's kind of an interesting movement that we've seen is a lot of times what we've seen is that younger people are questioning that model, kind of that big mega church, big worship leader, you know, everything's slick on stage and the pastor's got his hair slicked back and he's wearing $500 jeans. You know, we've kind of seen young people almost lead the charge pushing back against that kind of stuff recently, you know, because we were the ones who grew up with that and started to question as we got older, you know, are these assumptions, is this what church is really supposed to look like?
Yep. Again, just to read a little bit from it, all three guitarists will sound as though they're copying absolutely every riff they play from the U2 song. Then you got a worship leader checklist: impossibly nice hair or sweet hat, piercings, at least one visible tattoo, inner forearm preferred, designer jeans, rock star presence, those kinds of things. So there is a sense in which each time you turn the page, you go, oh, okay, that relates certainly to something that maybe I've seen in one particular area of worship. And if nothing else, I think that's what you're doing, calling us to think about what we've sort of accepted as sort of Christian kind of performance and kind of Christian manners, then if nothing else, Kyle, when you go to other countries or even in other parts of the country, you go, what I was assuming is Christian is just sort of cultural, and I can recognize that there are different forms of worship, and there are different circumstances that believers can put themselves in. And so, if nothing else, your chapter there on worshiping like a pro kind of skewers a couple of things that cause us to step back and reevaluate how we do church.
Yeah, and that's really the idea, because you can go back 50 years or 100 years, and the experiences that Christians were having, that real believers are having, are completely different from the experiences that we have. And like you said, you can go to another country, you go one country over, and all of a sudden it's like, wow, this is not the Christian experience that I grew up with. And when you realize that these people are also true believers, you start to wonder how much we've swallowed as being part of the gospel that's actually just cultural assumptions.
Well, now, again, if you're going to do mission work, and certainly all sorts of individuals that have been on this program, including myself, go to other countries and do that, you have to make sure that you're, if you will, exporting Christianity, not American churchianity. And so I think, if nothing else, this book is a little bit of an antidote to that as well. But speak to that for just a minute, because it seems to me that you find it very easy, because I have seen many of the Babylon Bee posts. It seems like it is almost very easy. It's almost like shooting fish in a barrel, ducks in a barrel, whatever illustration you want to use, to satirize cultural Christianity here in America. Any thoughts about why that is?
American Christianity is really easy to satirize because so much of it has been cultural assumptions. You know, you can just look at how the world sees the church nowadays, and what they see is preachers making millions of dollars and living in giant mansions, and us holding these rock concerts on Sunday mornings, like that's supposed to draw the world into Christ. And the world notices that our priorities are not centered around the gospel, and the world notices that our priorities are not centered around Christ. And when that becomes, who we are, or at least who we are perceived to be, then it's just such an easy thing for us to use satire to kind of cut that fat away and help call us to a truer understanding of the gospel and the church.
Wow. How do you put these things together? Because I have this image of you guys sitting around a table, somebody saying, I just went to church last week, and boy, you wouldn't believe when they said such as that. I said, oh, that'd be a good one to maybe a story about or something like that. How do you kind of brainstorm and pull together the stories that end up on the Babylon Bee?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much like that, except it's all done online. So,
yeah,
we kind of have an internal forum, and we're avid note takers. So if you see something funny that the pastor's doing or the worship band's doing, you can scribble it down and post it. And then when you see other writers have had that same experience, they're like, oh, that's so true. Then we can kind of begin some collaboration on what would be the best angle to take.
Well, and again, some of those stay with you. And again, I'll be using myself as an example. We've had Matt Chandler in this program a number of times before. He's just down the road. And then you had one where you talk about Matt Chandler accidentally lands a plane in his church because he's using his hands. Now, I cannot watch Matt Chandler. As soon as he starts moving his hands, I think of the Babylon Bee, because he does use his hands too much. If there's one thing you learn in pedagogy and in sermon preparation, you don't use your hands as much as he does. And there's just a perfect example of, he will be marked the rest of his life by one little piece that you put in the Babylon Bee, don't you think?
Yeah, we really appreciate Chandler and a lot of the work he's done. We got that idea because, we watched some YouTube videos of him, and we enjoy some of his sermons and all that, and we'll watch it, and it's the first thing you notice is just the wild gestures flying all around. And so, yeah, that became the perfect basis for a Babylon Bee.
Yeah, I don't think he's ever going to outlive that one. So you had that one stick, and that has got super glue on it. Okay, just before I let you go, I think there are going to be some people, Kyle, they're going to say, okay, you're just making fun of Christians. What's the point? Help us understand kind of what you would like to achieve, not only with this book, How to Be a Perfect Christian, but any of the posts that the Babylon Bee puts on Facebook and other places.
Yeah, the difference between good satire and bad satire is that good satire wants to achieve a lasting impact, and it wants to make change. And so for us, good satire says, here's something silly that the church is doing. Let's change that. Not, here's something silly that the church is doing, and all you Christians are morons, and you guys should stop believing in God. You should stop following Jesus. Like, that's not the point. That's the point of a lot of satire of religion that we've seen from outside the church. But doing satire from within the church, we want to call people to a truer understanding of the gospel. One of my very first pieces was Holy Spirit unable to move through congregation as fog machine breaks. And that's a great example of something where, it's making fun of churches that use big fog machines and laser lights and all that, and it makes people laugh. But then it's supposed to make people say, hey, have I made the production of the worship band and the production of the worship experience an idol? Have I made that be so important that if those elements were to fall away, I couldn't worship God? So yeah, we're really trying to make people follow Jesus more closely through our satire, not simply, just mock Christians or make religion look stupid.
Well, I might just mention, too, that everyone gets a target sooner or later. On Friday, we talked about, and I've got a commentary coming out on cultural appropriation, because we had this young girl, Kazia Dam, who's not Asian, but wore basically a traditional Chinese dress, and the social justice warriors went nuts. Well, what you have, and as people go to BabylonB.com, they'll see fighting cultural appropriation. From now on, Taco Bell will only serve customers of Mexican descent. So you're obviously skewering not only the church, but political correctness, and there's that's a healthy target there. Boy, that is a target-rich environment there. So just again, if some of you out there would like to enjoy some of the work of Babylon B, maybe like to correspond with them or put some of those on your own website, again, we have a link there to BabylonB.com, but also this new book out, and it is published by Multnomah. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we have a link there as well. It is about almost 200 pages of great material. And again, How to Be a Perfect Christian, your comprehensive guide to flawless spiritual living. And again, Kyle Mann, I appreciate you joining us today here on Point of View.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we have a lot more to cover, and we'll get into some of the news. First of all, we'll look at this issue of everything from food stamps to welfare reform. We'll be talking with Kristina Rasmussen about that. Then we will have in the second hour, Steve Moore will be looking at this very important issue, goodbye OPEC. Who would have ever guessed? And so that will be of interest. And then some very important stories coming down about how the Broward schools lied to Senator Marco Rubio. Federal judge rebuking the Mueller investigation. And before it's all through, a couple of pieces on Ted Cruz finding ways to work around the filibuster and maybe giving President Donald Trump credit for some of his accomplishments. That's a piece coming out today by Robert Knight. So we have a lot to cover in the next hour and a half. We will take a break and come back and start covering some of that right after these important messages.
Point of View turned life right side up for Emily's children. Emily listens in Illinois. She and her husband blissfully sent their children off each day to what she called our small, quaint public school, until Point of View led them to watch the documentary Indoctrination. She said, "We came to realize the need for us to educate our children at home. We want their education to be built on the solid foundation of Scripture." Emily said that would not have happened were it not for Point of View's bold consistency of shining light on public education. Your support for Point of View changes the future for children like Emily's. It leads people to start schools and ministries and businesses that change lives. How has the Truth Team impacted you? Please invest to bring truth to other families like Emily's. Support Truth today. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. First of all, we want to spend some time talking about welfare reform. It is something we've talked about in the past. It's been a while, but there's a very good reason, and that is President Trump has signed an executive order on welfare reform. We're going to talk about what that means. Also, a new survey that has come out through the Foundation for Government Accountability on the fact that you, as voters, support food stamp reforms in the Farm Bill. And to help us understand understand all of these issues, we bring to the microphone Kristina Rasmussen, who is the Vice President of Federal Affairs for the Foundation for Government Accountability. She, in the past, has also served as the Chief of Staff to the Illinois Governor, and probably is best known to many of us around the table as an individual that was the president of the Illinois Policy Institute in the past, individual that graduated from Randolph-Macon Women's College and has a master's degree in political management from George Washington University. And Kristina, welcome to Point of View.
Thanks so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Well, let's, if we can, start with the president. We earlier were talking about his speech here at the NRA convention, and of course he's been speaking to a number of different issues, but one of the articles we've posted here, just came out last month by you, is welfare reform is happening fast, and it really is, because this is something I remember many times talking about in the 1990s when there was a welfare reform package put forward by, at that time, the Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, and then sort of reluctantly signed by President Bill Clinton. We had all sorts of concerns that this would actually throw people out on the streets and the rest. Didn't happen. Actually, it turned out to be very good, but we've sort of moved away from that idea of having able-bodied individuals move from welfare to work, and so this is the attempt by the president, isn't it?
Yeah, so the great news is that there are a lot of different things happening in Washington, D.C. right now to try to tackle this problem of having a near-record amount of able-bodied adults on welfare, even as we have record low unemployment. So you see the president issuing an executive order asking his federal agencies to refocus their programs back on work rather than just continuing dependency. And in Congress, you also see some movement with one of the biggest welfare programs, and I'm speaking of food stamps, because it's authorized in the Farm Bill, which is up for consideration this year. So across the board, we see some pretty exciting things happening.
Well, again, let's come back to something you said in passing, but it's really important to understand that we have historic low unemployment. In the next hour, we're going to be talking with Stephen Moore. We're going to be talking primarily about OPEC and things of that nature, but I also want to get into the fact that just the other day, 3.9% unemployment. That's almost full employment. So we have a time where you have low unemployment rates, and sometimes employers still looking to fill open jobs. If you don't think so, just look at the jobs available page in your newspaper or online. And yet, at a time when we have low unemployment, we have, as you said, record numbers of individuals, some of whom are able-bodied individuals, on the welfare rolls.
That's right, and it's a problem. The last time the country had unemployment this low was around the turn of the century, so about 17, 18 years ago. And at that time, you know, we had able-bodied adults on welfare, but nothing like what we've seen today. We've seen those roles of able-bodied adults double, almost triple, and the spending has gone up fivefold. And you have to ask yourself, well, why is that? If the welfare system is designed to be a safety net to help people, if for some reason there's an economic crisis or there's other troubles, to serve as a trampoline net, if you will, to catch people and then send them back up again, you know, why are there so many people on it today? And it's because that a lot of the reforms that happened in 1996, like you mentioned, were eroded during the Clinton and Obama era. The bureaucrats issued new rules and regulations, which made it easier for people to get on the program and stay there. And it's difficult right now because we've got employers who are saying, you know, as long as someone can pass a drug test and shows up to work with a smile on their face, I will train them. That's how badly I need workers. So we have workers in this country. They're just sitting on the sidelines right now on welfare, and that's why this conversation at this moment is so important.
If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. You know, Christine, every time we talk about this, of course, we have some people calling in. We'll say, well, we're supposed to have welfare for people that really need it. And I've said, well, that's no one's disagreeing with that. Certainly, this is the program is primarily intended to be a hand up, not a hand out. Your trampoline illustration is another good illustration, and that is, I certainly have no concerns about trying to help individuals who are down and out, although I still believe that the church can be a much better provider of that than the government. But I think all of us, unless we are, you know, just maybe completely oblivious to the reality, have a problem with people that are able-bodied and simply have seen that this has become sort of a lifestyle. And as a result, your article says there are now nearly 21 million able-bodied adults dependent on food stamps. That's more than 3 times as many in 2000. That would tell me that something has gone wrong. Can you maybe explain why that has exploded so much in just these last 18 years?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and we've studied it, and it turns out that states figured out that they could abuse loopholes written into the system when the bureaucrats went to write the regulations governing these programs. And over the past decade and a half, people figured out, well, I can increase my welfare rolls this way and supposedly bring down more federal dollars into my state, and therefore that's a good thing, so I'm going to, do that as much as I possibly can. And I think you made a really good distinction earlier about who we're talking about, because it's easy to say the phrase able-bodied adult. Well, what does that really mean? It's adults who are between the ages of 18 and 64. So we're not talking about kids. We're not talking about the elderly. We're talking about people who are physically fit and medically ready to work, and that includes physical health and mental health. So, of the folks who are ready to work and can work, that's who we're talking about. Certainly no one in any sort of a fragile condition or the kind of folks that you would want to have welfare available for. But among those able-bodied adults, we've seen a rapid rise. And so let's just throw some statistics out there about who this is. Well, most of that cohort, if you will, is under the age of 35. About half are men. Half don't have children at home. So we're talking about often young millennials without dependents, without other responsibilities. And 2/3 are not working at all. That means they have no reported income. And we know that among able-bodied adults, 2 out of 5 people on food stamps have been there for at least 8 years. Mm-hmm. So this isn't a temporary help. This is something much different.
Listen, we can also talk about the poll that you put together, because what you found is that 84% of voters support the idea of requiring single parents on food stamps to cooperate with state child support programs. But this one I thought was very striking. 3/4, or 77%, want states to check assets of individuals who apply for or receive food stamps, because we do have some stories, as hard as it is to believe, of beneficiaries who receive food stamps that are actually millionaires.
This was shocking to me. I learned that it was possible for millionaires to get on the food stamp program. I thought, surely this can't be right. This is just no way. But it's true. And it's true because in more than 40 states, the asset test, which is supposed to check, okay, how much you have in your bank account, what kind of property do you own, has been completely waived. So you could have 7 figures sitting in your checking account and still get on the food stamp program. And this is wrong. There should be an income test and an asset test so that we're gearing our resources to the truly most needy among us. And I just should mention that homes and cars, pensions and retirement savings, that's not what I'm talking about when I say assets. I'm talking about liquid assets that you could otherwise use to take care of yourself. So in Minnesota, there was a honest-to-goodness millionaire who wanted to see if this was true, got on the program, received food stamps for a short time, ultimately donated all the money to a charity because he didn't feel like it was right, but really did us all a service to show that, yes, this is possible. It is legal. That doesn't mean it's right. And that's why it's so important in the Farm Bill they're talking about right now up in Congress, that they would put an end to this so that if you were a millionaire, you could not get food stamps. So that's the kind of reforms that we're talking about right now, and it just goes to show how important and timely they are.
Let's take a break, and if you would like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to know a little bit more about Kristina Rasmussen, we have a link to that website, and we'll talk more about the Foundation for Government Accountability in just a minute. Right beneath it is the article about voters support food stamp reforms in the Farm Bill, and then if you scroll down a little bit further, you'll also find the piece by Kristina on welfare reform. So both of those are on the website. I would encourage you to read them, maybe print them out, pass them around. We have a share button, too. You can put them on your Facebook page or your Twitter feed and start a conversation. But if you'd like to join us, we'd like to hear your conversation with us. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Brian Finnemore is described as a fundamentalist Christian. He worked for a hydroelectric company in Bangor, Maine. Everyone there knew he was a Christian, and that's where the problem seemed to begin. The talk in the garage where Brian worked was often vulgar. His coworkers made explicit, demeaning jokes about their wives. It was more than Brian could stand, and he finally spoke up, questioning how they could carry on in such a manner and explaining that such conversation was offensive to him because of his religious beliefs. You can probably guess what happened next. Brian's coworkers turned their crude jokes on him, targeting Brian's wife instead of their own. He complained to his supervisors, but they took no action. It was too much, so Brian resigned. After he filed a claim of religious discrimination, the lower court granted summary judgment in favor of the company. The Supreme Judicial Court of Maine reversed that decision, explaining that whether a comment is of a religious nature or whether it occurred because of an individual's religious beliefs or would have not occurred but for the individual's religion is a question of fact that a jury should decide. Brian's case is a good reminder that sometimes it takes a jury of one's peers to sort through all the facts in order to defend an employee's religious liberty. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. Let me ask you, what if America's best attorneys from the very top law firms got together to defend religious freedom in court? That's exactly what's happening at First Liberty. And the best news? We're winning over 90% of our legal actions. Come learn more at firstliberty.org. You'll be encouraged. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. What are your thoughts? Do you think that somebody who is receiving a welfare benefit should be required to work if indeed he or she is able-bodied? And what about the idea of drug testing those individuals that receive welfare benefits? And what about means testing those individuals and maybe even requiring single parents to cooperate with a child support enforcement effort and those kinds of things? What are your thoughts? 1-800-351-1212. And just before we get any further, Kristina, let's talk about this organization, the Foundation for Government Accountability. We have a link to thefga.org. People don't have to remember it because we have a link there. And you have lots of information there, but talk about some of the material that is available at your website when people land there.
Well, the FGA is an organization that is a policy nonprofit, and we have a pretty simple goal, and it's trying to connect people with the American dream. So that includes removing policy barriers to work and helping people find a pathway forward. And we work at the state government level as well as at the federal government level, because when you think about it, a lot of the laws out there are federal laws that then states need to interpret or implement. So it just makes sense to have that connection. And we do lots of things for folks. You can see our policy briefs. We've got polling that shows just how popular welfare reform is with Republicans, independents, and Democrats. We write commentary and so forth so you can stay up to date with the latest conversation that's happening within government and how it affects all of us as citizens. So it's a pretty great group, and it's dedicated to helping people find their version of the American dream with that work opportunity.
You know, we mentioned the welfare and work program back in 1996, and since I'm the oldest one around the table here, and we were doing broadcasts on Point of View back then, of course, long before that as well, we saw what was happening from the commentators, that this was going to throw people out on the streets, that it's going to be a draconian program, it was going to be oppressive. But really, the 1996 welfare reform program said that an able-bodied adult was intended to work, train, or volunteer for at least 20 hours per week in order to be eligible for something like that. And so it seems to me that if we implement something similar, all of those doom and gloom predictions that happened in the late 1990s are not going to happen again here in the 21st century, are they?
Yeah, there was a lot of doom and gloom that was thrown out there as reasons why we shouldn't reform welfare, but they just didn't hold up with the test of time. A lot of the 1996 welfare reform had to do with welfare cash assistance, particularly as it related to single moms. And when single moms were asked to work, train, or volunteer, we saw great results for them and their families. People going back to work quickly, incomes growing, child poverty dropping. And so, you know, we often look at the many societal problems that are in front of us, and often work is one of the most simple solutions out there in terms of, you know, whether it be someone coming out of prison, for example, are they going to go back into a life of crime? Well, it turns out if they're working, you know, that's one of the best indicators if someone will stay on the good path. Or, you know, among young women, 8 out of 10 say the number one thing that they look for in a potential spouse is, does he or she have, you know, a steady job? So work really matters in so many different ways in our life, and it's such a simple solution, but it's a really meaningful solution. And so government, whenever possible and whenever appropriate, should be promoting it.
Sure. And again, we have listeners in the state of Kentucky, and you have some information about that. But let's take some phone calls along the way. We'll head to Georgia first. Michael, you're on with Kristina Rasmussen.
Oh, great. Yes, sir. Yeah, I'm actually traveling right now, and I caught your station. I'm coming through Pearson, Georgia, going back home and all, and I'm enjoying your show a lot, and I just got your phone number when you said it. And I wanted to call in and remind you that right after Obama was elected, within the first year or so, right after he changed the Marriage Act and everything, right around that same time is when he and Eric Holder changed the work requirement for food stamps, and then that's what really shot it up. I mean, I don't remember the exact statistic, but it pretty much close to almost doubled it, sort of. But you know,
there you go. Yeah, Eric Holder. Go. Kristina, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, you're spot on. You've got your history right. Part of the stimulus, if you remember that, back in 2008, 2009, was a massive expansion of food stamps, you know, during a time of economic crisis. And what you would have expected to see is that as the Great Recession faded away, that the rolls would also come down. But they haven't. They've been very sticky upward. And that's in part because states figured out how to keep gaming the system. So one of the ways they do that is a state can decide to waive part or all of the work requirements in certain areas. And so they figured out how to do this, and they keep doing it. So if you live in California right now, the work requirement for able-bodied adults on food stamps is entirely waived. No one has to work a single hour, and that's because of a state choice. But if you're, say, in Indiana, there's no work requirement being waived. You need to work, train, or volunteer 20 hours a week. And so you look at the unemployment rate right now in California, and it's pretty low, just like the rest of the country. In fact, some of the counties, you know, where Facebook is headquartered and so forth, super low unemployment, but they're gaming the system, and that's why we need to tighten it up so they can't keep playing with the numbers so that people across the country are asked to work, train, or volunteer 20 hours a week.
Let's take some more phone calls. We'll go to Susan. Susan, you're on with Kristina Rasmussen.
Can you hear me?
We certainly can.
Okay. My comment to this is that there are so many people out there that are abusing the government checks, government systems, welfare checks and food stamps, and I totally feel like the government should have accountability for each individual that's getting this money. My parents were living off of only the retirement that came in, and they just barely made it. And now they were like, I don't know how much money it was under that
sure.
ceiling.
Let me get Kristina. We're getting close on time here. This whole issue of Medicare fraud, welfare fraud, and some of that, are there any things that we could do to prevent some of this abuse?
Yeah, there's a lot of great things in the Farm Bill. This idea that if someone registers for food stamps in one state, it has to be checked across the national database to make sure they're not also pulling benefits in other states. Similarly, if someone is losing their card again and again and again, rather than just sending them new cards because they might be sold, come in and talk with a caseworker about, holding onto your card and making sure you don't lose it. Just little things like that can go a long way to stopping a lot of the fraud and trafficking. And this matters because, of course, it's taxpayer dollars funding all of this. But if we're spending money on welfare fraud, that's money we can't spend on cops, kids, and roads and everything else that government does. And so people feel very passionately, understandably, because they, care about doing right by people, and this isn't right.
Well, again, you can go to the FGA, which stands for Foundation for Government Accountability. You don't have to even remember all that because we have those links on our website. We have both of these articles, and so if you'd like to read a little bit more, maybe interact, use some of these to maybe write a letter to the editor, or if you'd like to post one of these articles on your Facebook post or your Twitter feed, it is all available at our website, pointofview.net. And Kristina, thank you again for the good work that you've done over the years at the Illinois Policy Institute, and thank you also for the work you're doing today at the Foundation for Government Accountability. I appreciate you being on the program. Let's do it again.
Thanks so much.
We need to take a break. In the last hour, we are going to be talking with Steve Moore and goodbye to OPEC energy, and then we'll get into all sorts of issues in the news. Got a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Last hour today, we're going to spend some time, first of all, talking with Stephen Moore about this piece that we have posted here, Goodbye OPEC. A little bit later, we'll talk about tariffs and a number of other issues as well. Stephen Moore, of course, is an individual that we followed for many years here on Point of View. Used to write, of course, for the Wall Street Journal, and is the Distinguished Visiting Fellow and Project of Economic Growth at the Heritage Foundation. Individual with a degree from the University of Illinois, as well as a Master's of Arts in Economics, George Mason University, and this piece on OPEC, fascinating. Stephen Moore, welcome back to Point of View.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I enjoy hearing you on Rick Roberts and a number of other things, so oftentimes we're quoting you when you're not even here, because I'll say, I just heard him say such and such, and so again, but it is good to have you here for this vision on OPEC. My own history is a good example. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I remember when I was about ready to go to college, I had some neighbors. They went to Stanford. They wanted me to study under Paul Ehrlich, and I said, no, I don't really have much interest in that. But by the 1970s, you know, we had some of these oil embargoes, and of course he was saying that it's going to be the end of the world as we know it, and we'll never be energy independent. Well, of course, I very early on found another individual that I know you work with, Julian Simon, who was giving an alternative viewpoint. But no one, I think, whether they were an industrialist or an environmentalist, would predict what you say, and that is America really is on its way to energy dominance. Talk about that.
Well, we sure are. By the way, Julian Simon was my mentor. I met Julian Simon at the University of Illinois in 1980, and he was saying, you know, we're not running out of oil long before it was cool to say that, and everyone thought he was a maniac when he said that. And of course, you know, I hope none of your listeners believe that America's running out of oil and gas, because, ladies and gentlemen, we're running into it, not out of it, and in a big way. And this is a result of the shale oil and gas revolution, which really changed everything. It started about 10, 11 years ago, where we finally figured out how to crack the code and crack through that shale rock, you know, sometimes 2 miles deep in the ground, and get at, you know, massive amounts of oil and gas. It almost tripled overnight how much oil and gas we had. And so the long and short of this is, you just said that the United States of America this time next year should be the number one producer of oil and gas in the world, outproducing Saudi Arabia. That's according to the Energy Department. And, you know, by the end of this decade, you know, in a couple of years, we could be exporting more oil and gas than we import. Wouldn't that be amazing?
Well, again, I have that chart for people to see that was in the Washington Times, and you have imports of crude oil and petroleum products, and it's dropping. If you will, if you were to think of it as like a map from the northwest to the southeast. And then on the other hand, you have the blue domestic crude oil and production, and that's going like from the southwest to the northeast. In other words, so one's going up, one's going down, and it's just striking because I know you've been on with John Hannity and others that say, well, I really want to push towards energy independence. And everybody, even I've been in Republican gatherings, I've been even around oil producers sometimes where they all just kind of roll their eyes, say, that is not going to happen. But again, due to some of the remarkable changes in shale oil and gas, we could actually do some things that no one, I think, would have predicted even 5 or 10 years ago.
That's exactly right. I mean, even people in the industry itself didn't see this coming. And that, by the way, is the result of American ingenuity and inventiveness and our entrepreneurs who went out there and found this oil and gas. I'm good friends with Harold Hamm. He's the one who really developed the Bakken Shale in North Dakota. 10, 15 years ago, they were growing wheat in North Dakota. That's about it. Now it's one of the, it's like Saudi Arabia out there in North Dakota. So it's a great tribute to American know-how. We're way ahead of the world technologically. And I do believe, I used to talk to Donald Trump about this, when I was the senior economic advisor for the campaign. And, I would tell him, I'd say, because he loved this story. I mean, Donald Trump gets it, and I'd say, sir, by the end of, your first term, we could be energy independent. And he'd look at me and say, Steve, I don't want energy independence. I want energy dominance. So, and we have a possibility at that. I mean, and incidentally, that's the other factor that's important in this whole story is that, it started under Barack Obama, although everything he tried to do was he hated fossil fuels, right? Because he's obsessed with this climate change agenda. So he tried to hold back the oil and gas and coal production. Trump has exactly the opposite view. He wants to build the pipelines. He wants to drill on public lands. He wants to build the LNG terminals. He wants to allow, relax some of the, regulations that were put in place that tried to, stymie our oil and gas development. That's made a big difference. We estimate, by the way, that if we were to, develop our oil and gas under federal lands, and I'm not talking about, Yosemite or Yellowstone National Park. I'm talking about on non-environmentally sensitive land because, about 30% of this, country is owned by the federal government.
Yeah.
If you start drilling on that land, we estimate the federal government over the next 25 years could raise something like 10 to $15 trillion in royalty payments that we could then use to reduce our national debt.
Yeah, and that's the next point I wanted to come to because, we have listeners that are in like the Permian Basin in Texas or the Bakken Shale in North Dakota. So they obviously benefit locally, but we as a country could benefit because over time, this could be one of the very few ways that we could find a way to pay down the national debt. True?
Yep, exactly. And by the way, it doesn't cost us anything, right? We don't have to raise taxes on anyone. We don't have to cut vital public services for anyone. We just basically, these oil companies and energy companies want to develop this land, so they will do it and they'll pay us to do it. So as far as I see it, let's see, we create jobs, we increase our national output, reduce our dependency on foreign oil, and we raise revenue for the government. I mean, what's not to like about this story?
Well, then one other thing you might add to it real quickly before we take a break is oil broke the $70 mark. So for at least those of you that benefit from oil prices, that is something that's been suppressed for some time. And so that's just another way in which, again, the bang for the buck would be rather dramatic. And is there any possibility, just before we take a break, that OPEC, because of this, might figure out some way to actually produce more oil so that we would not be energy dominant?
Oh, I'm sorry. Say that again.
Is there a way that OPEC can produce more oil so that they would?
Actually, I mean, look, I think OPEC is making a big mistake here. I mean, by the way, OPEC really doesn't exist anymore, frankly. OPEC is one country. It's Saudi Arabia. And so Saudi Arabia is really the only country that, other than the United States and maybe Russia, that really matters. All the rest of the countries are bit players. And so Saudi Arabia has been cutting back on their production because they want to raise the global price. There was a piece in the Wall Street Journal on Saturday saying they want to raise the global price to $80 a barrel. Mm-hmm. But I don't think they have that kind of – look, they can in the very short term, control the world oil price. But now that the United States has been, become such a – monster producer, it really reduces their leverage. And, you mentioned the 70s. I remember, when OPEC had us at they had a knife at our throat.
I remember that. Yes.
They can't do that anymore.
That is amazing. We need to take a break, and when we come back, just want to chat with you for a few more minutes on a couple of issues. First of all, unemployment, 3.9%, lowest since 2000, and a piece that came out just the other day in the Heritage Foundation, Trump must think twice about tariffs, something we've been talking about on this program. And so we'll continue our conversation for a few more minutes with Stephen Moore. And, of course, if you'd like to join us, you can either ask a question while he's with us, or I'm going to certainly leave an open line for the last half hour so that we can get into a variety of issues, including some questions about the Mueller investigation. We've got a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, the crime rate is up in many cities, so maybe it's time to consider a solution rarely suggested. Let's see what faith-based organizations and people of faith can do. The evidence is that it can reduce the crime rate and the recidivism rate in our prisons. This is the argument Baylor University criminologist Byron Johnson makes in his book, More God, Less Crime. Sadly, most social scientists and even criminologists seem reluctant to make the connection between faith and the impact religious perspectives could have on America's crime problem. Dr. Johnson believes that a faith-based ministry or message doesn't resonate with most social scientists. Many are even hostile to religion, as demonstrated by the opening chapter in his book entitled The Last Acceptable Prejudice. Dr. Johnson also says that faith-based organizations were merely tolerated within the criminal justice system. In some places, they're seen as valuable and even helpful. In other jurisdictions, they're viewed with suspicion. This is unfortunate since the criminal justice system is facing cutbacks and shrinking budgets. Prison ministries like Bill Glass, Prison Fellowship, and Kairos Prison Ministry can provide people and programs that can make a difference. Faith-based organizations of all kinds can provide volunteers and educators to help with programs in life skills and adult education. The book is full of positive examples of what can happen when Christians get involved in their local community. He tells the story of the Boston Miracle, where police and pastors worked together to break the stranglehold gangs had in the community. He also talks about the mission of the Center for Neighborhood Enterprise and Violence-Free Zones. He even gives practical advice on the important issues of prisoner reentry and aftercare. Most importantly, he provides a review of the literature so that churches and faith-based organizations can show skeptics that the title of the book is true. More God, Less Crime. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Stephen Moore with us for a few more minutes. Again, he is a fellow with the Heritage Foundation. We have a link to heritage.org. I've been a member of the Heritage Foundation for decades. Matter of fact, when I was at the NRA convention this weekend here in Dallas, they had a booth. It was good to see some of those individuals there as well. Stephen Moore, let's, if we can, talk about, first of all, unemployment. This is striking when you talk about the unemployment figure that is the lowest it's been since 2000. And again, the question that a lot of people ask is, how did that take place? Why do we have such a low unemployment figure right now in 2018?
Well, because we have a pro-business president who is very pro-growth and has a real plan of economic revival. I'm proud to have worked with Trump on some of this. We helped devise his tax plan, which is working unbelievably well. I saw the president at Mar-a-Lago a few weeks ago and just spoke to him for a couple of minutes, and he was so excited. Steve, can you believe this tax plan, how well it's working? I said, sir, it's working better than we even thought it would.
That's what I'm saying, yeah.
That's been amazing. And then, of course, the deregulation. We talked about the energy policies. You know, those are great, high-paying jobs, $100,000 to $150,000 a year, the pipe fitters and welders and all of these folks make in that industry. And so it's just a great story of a guy who really knows how to create jobs, and boy, is he doing it. And by the way, it's not just the national unemployment rate that's good. There are 14 states right now that have the lowest unemployment rate in their recorded history, and I believe you're in one of them. Do you live in Texas?
I do live in Texas. That's where we're broadcasting from today. That's true, yeah.
Well, you have the lowest unemployment. We started measuring state unemployment rates something like 30 years ago. Texas, California, North Dakota, Alabama, Mississippi, I could go down the line. There are 14 states that have their lowest unemployment rate ever. So this is, and by the way, I was on CNN earlier today, and they were saying, well, this is because of Obama. This is the Obama effect. And I said, yeah, this is the effect that Barack Obama is no longer president. That's why we have a good economy.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up because that's what I hear all the time. Well, this was done by the previous administration, but after about a year plus into it, you have to say, no, I think it probably has something to do with the president's policies. But just before we go,
by the way, let me just intervene something there. So, at the same time, 5 years after he was president, because we had this lousy recovery under Obama, he was still blaming Bush 5 years after he was in the White House. So now, 1.5 years in office, Donald Trump has created a stronger economy than Obama did in any single one of his 8 years in office.
It is amazing. Well, one of the places where you and the president obviously disagree are tariffs, and one of the pieces that is in a Heritage Foundation, again, Trump must think twice about tariffs. This is one of the places where I quote you even when you're not on the program, because you've said before, and I think it's a good line, that when we have tariffs, we're supposed to be doing this so that we can make Americans prosperous. But the reality is we're actually punishing ourselves, aren't we?
Well, it depends. So, look, I from the moment I started working with Donald Trump, he and I had a long discussion about this, and he knows that I have a somewhat different attitude about it than he does. So, I did not favor the steel tariffs. I just thought those were misguided because I think it would make, everything we buy more expensive, and it would also hurt a lot of our manufacturing workers who use steel in what they produce. So I don't agree with that, but I do believe that Trump is right in getting very tough with China, because China is, free trade means both countries reduce their trade barriers and open up their markets to the other country. But frankly, China's not doing that. China's cheating and they're stealing, and they've become, I believe, an adversary of the United States, not an ally. And so when it comes to getting tough with China, I find myself in great agreement with Donald Trump, because we can't continue to turn a blind eye onto the activities that are going on in China. They steal $300 billion of our technology every year, and shame on George W. Bush and shame on Barack Obama for never doing anything about it. Now we have a president who is doing something about it.
Well, and again, on your steel issue, if you save 140,000 steel jobs, look what it does to millions and millions of individuals in manufacturing. But let's talk about some of the positives. South Korea.
By the way, there are something like 5 million manufacturing workers in the United States, and only about 140,000 of them are in steel. So, you're putting 50 jobs in jeopardy for every job you might save. I mean, look, Donald Trump's heart is in the right place. He wants to save these blue-collar workers in a lot of these towns in the Midwest that have been dying. But this particular strategy, I just cannot endorse.
I would agree. Let's come back to, I've used the example South Korea, see if you would agree, because there is a good example of where once the threat came about, they changed some of the various limits and those kinds of things, and some of the regulations which would allow us now to sell more cars, for example, in South Korea. Talk about that, if you might.
Yeah, exactly. So Trump got tough with South Korea and said, look, we're running a big trade deficit with you. We're buying your stuff. You're not buying our stuff. We lowered our trade tariffs. You haven't done it. You're cheating on these, so-called free trade agreements. So, why don't you get your act together and start, reducing your tariffs? And South Koreans have agreed to do that. We'll see if they follow through. I mean, with all these countries, you have to do what Reagan used to say, which is trust but verify, right? You have to make sure they're actually doing what they promised they're going to do. But, so far so good. But the big enchilada here is obviously China. Right. A U.S. delegation went over to Beijing last week. I still haven't heard the news yet about, whether they got some concessions from China. But Trump needs to – look, Trump is saying we're going to slap tariffs on you unless you change your behavior. And I hope the outcome is that I don't want to see a trade war with China, but if they continue to steal and cheat from us, I don't see what other options we have.
Well, and again, it seems to me, back to the point that you make so many times, that if we really want to make America competitive globally, it's taxes. We've looked at tax reform. Regulatory, we've looked at that. Energy, we've looked at that. Are there any other policy changes? In some respects, people said, well, he's done all the things that we've asked him to do, but are there some other changes that need to take place?
I'd still like to see Obamacare repealed. I think, I've said a lot of things in praise of Donald Trump. He knows I'm upset with him because I don't think he should have signed that omnibus spending bill. You know which one I'm talking about.
Right.
The one that spent, hundreds of billions of dollars over the next few years, more than we should. Now, the Congress sent that to him and put the gun to his head and said, sign this or the government's going to shut down. I know he thought long and hard about it. In the end, he agreed to sign the bill. I wish that he had basically sent it back to Congress and say, we can't be wasting money. And by the way, Chuck Schumer is the Republicans run Congress, but Chuck Schumer, held the budget hostage. And so I'm not happy with the trends in spending because the spending is going back up again.
Yes. Well, again, pay attention to all those economic factors. One last time, let me just mention that, again, we have a link to heritage.org. Of course, you also have other information there in the Heritage Foundation about the Trump deal with Iran and all sorts of other issues. But if people want to get more articles by you, they can simply go to heritage.org and just go to Stephen Moore, right?
You got it.
Oh,
thanks for being a member of Heritage. It's people like you that make our organization possible. So thank you.
Well, thank you for joining us, and I look forward to the next opportunity to spend some time with Stephen Moore. So thank you for joining us on Point of View.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to get into a couple of issues that I thought you'd like to hear about. First of all, let me just mention that we've posted these articles, Goodbye OPEC. This one I think you're going to find very interesting, and you may want to post it, because still there are just a lot of people that are convinced that we'll never reach energy independence, and as we point out, we'll probably reach energy dominance in short order. When we come back from the break, I certainly want to open up the phones to give you a chance again to join our conversation. What do you think about where the economy is going in terms of regulatory issues, the tariffs, as well as the issue of energy? That's certainly fair game. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how Senator Marco Rubio has said that actually the schools in Broward County were actually lying to him. And so that is an example of, if you will, government malfeasance, or at least something from the schools. We also have Alan Dershowitz, who's written a piece in The Hill, which is the, if you will, organ of record for Capitol Hill, in which he says the federal judge rightly rebukes Robert Mueller for questionable tactics. And then we have Andrew McCarthy and a piece that he has put together on the outrageous redactions to the Russia report. Turns out that sometimes when they redact these reports, it's not because of a security concern or that it might compromise a witness or a source. It's so that they could protect themselves from actually being investigated. And in some respects, redactions are due to protect the deep state. Also, of course, we've posted a piece that we will get to hopefully today, Ted Cruz's 4 ways to work around a filibuster. That's one of the issues that Stephen Moore sort of was alluding to as well. So we have lots of great material. It's all available at our website, pointofview.net. But in this last half hour, perhaps we've talked about some issues you would like to address, and I'll give you that opportunity with an open line, 1-800-351-1212. Go to the website, pointofview.net. You can find information about many of the guests we've had today, Kristina Rasmussen, Stephen Moore, and, of course, we certainly do encourage you to take the time to download these articles. Click that share button, put them on your Facebook page or a Twitter feed, and you will start a conversation, and it's one that I hope you'll do. We'll take a break. We'll be back right after this.
Does Point of View make any difference? I think Dr. Eric Walsh would say it does. Dr. Walsh was fired from his job as district health director for the state of Georgia, not because of anything he did or failed to do on the job, but because of sermons he preached in his local church. What does that have to do with Point of View? Jeremy Dies of First Liberty represented Dr. Walsh, and in February, the state of Georgia paid a large settlement for their religious discrimination. And Jeremy Dies became an attorney specializing in defending religious liberty, greatly because of what he learned listening to Point of View radio as a child. That is the kind of difference you make when you support the Truth Team, but we can't make that difference without your help. Become a partner today in this important mission of speaking truth in love. Join the Truth Team at pointofview.net/team. Choose your giving level, stretch a bit, and please do it today. Or call 800-347-5151. pointofview.net/team. Or 800-347-5151.
The Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. You know, some people lie, some people are doing things illegally, others are just incompetent, and for the next couple of minutes, I want to talk about a few of these that are of real concern and should be. And the first one is something that has been surfacing from the office of Senator Marco Rubio, of course, senator from Florida. And it turns out that it says in this particular article that came out recently that in the aftermath of the Parkland shooting, members of the press and government officials were kind of looking into the behavior of that shooter down there in Parkland. And one of the things that kept getting mentioned was promise. Now, promise is something that I've written about. I've done a commentary on. Penna Dexter's done a commentary. Promise stands for Preventing Recidivism through Opportunities, Mentoring, Intervention, Supports, and Education. Again, one of these little acronyms. It was an attempt to actually reduce the number of young people that might graduate or even just be in high school and then go from the school to the prison. It was called the School to Prison Pipeline. It was something developed under the Obama administration in the Department of Education, started in Miami-Dade, but then was adopted in Broward County. And there, the attempt was to try to reduce juvenile crime and what's called recidivism. By the way, my piece today in the Point of View website and the commentary is More God, Less Crime. So I talk about some ways in which I think we can reduce recidivism. But nevertheless, this was a concern that sometimes you would have, especially it might be African-American students, sometimes Hispanic-American students, that would act up on campus. The police would be called, so there'd be sort of like a police record. And so as a result, it became easier after they either graduated from high school or just left high school that they might end up in prison. It came to be known as the School to Prison Pipeline. And so the argument was, let's deal with these issues here. In other words, in order to reduce the crime rate, let's just not call it crime. Let's, in order to prevent young people from being put in prison, let's, whenever they are engaged in any kind of juvenile crime activity on the high school campus, let's see if we can have the schools address the issue with disciplinary actions so that they don't have a record. Well, as laudable as that might have been, it certainly didn't work out very well. And the issue at hand is the fact that certainly during the investigation after the Parkland shooting, Senator Marco Rubio actually asked, was this individual actually, that is, his name is Nicholas Cruz. I tend not to use the name, but it will be less confusing to use. Is this man, Nicholas Cruz, this boy, was he in the Promise program? And he was, in many cases, that is Senator Rubio, vilified. Remember when he went to the CNN town hall meeting? He was booed. He was disrespected. At one point, he was called a murderer and all the rest. And he was trying to figure out, was this individual, Nicholas Cruz, involved in the program? And, of course, everybody assured him that he was not. And, of course, this article says Senator Marco Rubio was lied to repeatedly. A school district and its officials had zero problem lying to a U.S. senator to protect their program. You can go to Marco Rubio's Twitter feed and find these. I'll just read two of them. He said, I was repeatedly told that the Parkland shooter was never in the Promise program I was asking questions about. Now it turns out that, in fact, he was. And then there's some other pieces that he's posted there as well. I'll leave those as they are. And then you have something else that is surfaced, and that is Ryan Petty, who is the father of one of the victims, Elena Petty. He was also been asking about this, and he has also written about the program's failures and the district's overall failure regarding crime on campus and school safety. Because, again, we've seen so many warning signs of Nicholas Cruz, signs that seemingly where the FBI dropped the ball, where the sheriff's department dropped the ball, where school officials dropped the ball. And this is the father, Ryan Petty. And again, you can go to find his Twitter feed. Ryan Petty says this is a stunning revelation, and one that flies in the face of previous statements. That the district released it on Sunday is all the more concerning. And another post, he said, however stunning, the focus should not be on any specific program. It's the totality of district failures that must be addressed. And so there are a lot of people that are starting to look into what's called the Promise program. One of those is Peter Kirsanow, who is a member of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And he actually said that the motivation behind Promise and similar programs wasn't what the advocates claimed. Here's what he said. Broward County adopted a lenient disciplinary policy similar to those adopted by many other districts under the pressure from the Obama administration to reduce racial disparities in suspensions and expulsions. He says in many of these districts, the drive to get our numbers right produced disastrous results with startling increases in both the number and the severity of disciplinary offenses, including assaults and beatings of teachers and students. And if you've ever been out on YouTube and seen some of the videos taken many times by students when a teacher is assaulted in the classroom by one of these students, and then the attempt to try to hide it by simply having some kind of school disciplinary action, this was all done for a laudable reason of trying to prevent the school to prison pipeline. But if you were to assault a teacher out of the school grounds, maybe out there on the street, you would have a record. The police would get involved. But because it happens on a campus, sometimes that's not the case. So, nevertheless, one of those pieces in which Marco Rubio was lied to, this one's a little bit different, came from Andrew McCarthy. We might get into this a little bit more tomorrow, because even printing this out took about 17 pages. Andrew McCarthy is a former federal prosecutor, and he's been pointing out that as you look at some of the material that has been released by the Department of Justice, and I might say released many times reluctantly, but when it finally is released, it is heavily redacted in some places. And those redactions aren't due to an attempt to protect a source or a confidential source or individual, or to protect national security. It seems like now it was an attempt to protect either questionable judgments or even in some cases, how did they put it, investigative irregularities in terms of how they were investigating some of this. And as some people have pointed out, they've redacted it simply so they can protect the swamp. And so we'll watch that one in the future as well. One last piece before we take a break, and then I'll come back to some of the suggestions by Senator Ted Cruz on how to fight the filibuster. And that is Alan Dershowitz, who's been on this program before, an individual who calls himself a civil libertarian, individual who is identified himself as a liberal, a progressive individual, of course, was a professor at Harvard Law School, and an individual that has been very comfortable with civil libertarians, ACLU types, and all the rest, who I found out recently from somebody who's been in studio with us that when Alan Dershowitz was here, he said he sort of feels like he's a persona non grata. He's had liberal friends for years, but now when he started to say, wait a minute, you liberals should be concerned about some of the things that are being done against Donald Trump, because it looks like he's actually criticizing those who are criticizing Trump, and so indirectly looking like he's supporting Trump, which he's not. A lot of his fellow liberals have run away from him. Well, if nothing else, what he says in this piece that appeared in The Hill is this. An experienced federal judge has confirmed what I've been arguing for months, namely that the modus operandi of special counsel Robert Mueller is to charge associates of President Trump with any crime they can find in order to squeeze them into turning against Trump. He quotes from Judge T.S. Ellis, who we mentioned just on Friday's program, who said, you don't really care about Mr. Manafort's bank fraud. What you really care about is information from Mr. Manafort that can give you what would reflect on Mr. Trump or lead to his prosecution or impeachment. And in this piece, Alan Dershowitz reminds us that civil libertarians in the past have been very critical of this tactic, since it was used by Senator Joseph McCarthy in the 1950s. to pressure witnesses to testify against various suspected communists. And he says in recent decades, it's been deployed against mobsters, terrorists, corporate predators. But Judge Ellis has accused Robert Mueller of using this tactic to develop a case against, as he says, a duly elected president of the United States. And that may explain why, whether it is Manafort or Michael Flynn or the personal attorney of the president, Michael Cohen, again, you have Alan Dershowitz blowing a whistle on that as well. Let's take a break. When we come back, I want to talk about how can we break up the filibuster. The filibuster has prevented good nominees from being on the court. It's prevented good legislation from being seriously considered. Senator Ted Cruz has some suggestions. We'll talk about those right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Brian Finnemore is described as a fundamentalist Christian. He worked for a hydroelectric company in Bangor, Maine. Everyone there knew he was a Christian, and that's where the problem seemed to begin. The talk in the garage where Brian worked was often vulgar. His coworkers made explicit, demeaning jokes about their wives. It was more than Brian could stand, and he finally spoke up, questioning how they could carry on in such a manner and explaining that such conversation was offensive to him because of his religious beliefs. You can probably guess what happened next. Brian's coworkers turned their crude jokes on him, targeting Brian's wife instead of their own. He complained to his supervisors, but they took no action. It was too much, so Brian resigned. After he filed a claim of religious discrimination, the lower court granted summary judgment in favor of the company. The Supreme Judicial Court of Maine reversed that decision, explaining that whether a comment is of a religious nature or whether it occurred because of an individual's religious beliefs or would have not occurred but for the individual's religion is a question of fact that a jury should decide. Brian's case is a good reminder that sometimes it takes a jury of one's peers to sort through all the facts in order to defend an employee's religious liberty. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. Let me ask you, what if America's best attorneys from the very top law firms got together to defend religious freedom in court? That's exactly what's happening at First Liberty. And the best news? We're winning over 90% of our legal actions. Come learn more at firstliberty.org. You'll be encouraged. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And for a few more minutes, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, or just sit back and listen for a few more minutes. Might just give you a preview of tomorrow. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the accomplishments of President Donald Trump. We recognize some of the moral issues, and Stormy is in the news all the time, so we'll be talking about that as well, and we'll get into that. But also, Robert Knight's put together a very good piece because some people have been talking about the immorality of Donald Trump, and he brings it back to some of the other actions by Ted Kennedy and Bill Clinton, and at the same time said, and this is something I've said on this program many times before, as much as we may be lamenting some of the moral failings of various presidents going all the way back to the 1960s, all the way up to the current president, we also have to pay attention to how that's going to affect you and your family, faith, family, and freedom, the kinds of pieces of legislation that will be passed or won't be passed, the kind of judges are going to be put on the court. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about that. Also, of course, we are now coming to the 70th anniversary of Israel, and some of the celebration taking place. Matter of fact, our good friend Gary Bauer was at the White House, one for the National Day of Prayer, but then also there for this Christian solidarity event with the Israeli embassy. And this is all because we are coming up to the 70th anniversary of the founding of the modern state of Israel. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll also be talking with our good friend Randy Frazee about what happens after death. That will be his new book, and we'll have that conversation with him. And so we just got a lot to cover tomorrow, so I hope you'll join us then. Okay, back to some of the important pieces of legislation. If you've heard me say it once, you've heard me say it many times, that the sad reality is oftentimes good legislation in the House of Representatives goes to the U.S. Senate to die. So Ted Cruz was at the NRA convention, and he actually sat down with some individuals and shared a little bit about what he thought might be able to be accomplished in this next year. He said at the beginning of last year, he laid out 4 big priorities for the Republican majority. That was tax reform, regulatory reform, Obamacare, and judges. And certainly on the tax cut bill that we talked about just a minute ago with Stephen Moore, that has been accomplished. Lifting some of the regulatory burdens, that's been accomplished at least in part, but will continue on. In terms of the judges, Ted Cruz said, I think that's been an unmitigated success. Not only Neil Gorsuch, but all the Federal Court of Appeals. But on the issue of Obamacare, he said that's perhaps the biggest unfinished commitment of Republicans, and don't know where that's going to go anytime soon. But then he spent a fair amount of time, and I'll try to summarize this quickly, on 4 suggestions on what to do with the issue of the filibuster, because that even came up in the conversation about Obamacare. If you can't get more than 50 to 51, at best 52 Republican votes, and you need 60, you just can't get a lot done, and that has been a problem. So real quickly, in case you want to take some notes, he's got 4 very good suggestions. I might even put these in a commentary about how to begin to at least work around a Democratic filibuster. The first is what's called the Congressional Review Act. This allowed them, and we've talked about this before, to repeal a whole series of regulations. Many of those were implemented during President Obama's term. A couple of them were implemented during President Bush's term. And so he believes that the Congressional Review Act is one way to remove some of these regulations and some of these other kinds of draconian actions that might actually hurt job creators. Number 2 are what are called rescissions. That's a way in which you can actually pull back some kind of spending. That pretty much takes place through the White House. But again, those are some things that can be done at least by President Trump and Vice President Pence. Number 3 is budget reconciliation. And that has been a vehicle for some of the biggest victories, Ted Cruz points out, including the tax cut. And he says we also should take up, he said, reconciliation in 2018, and that might be a way we could score more victories for the American people. And then the final point, and I'd never even thought about this, is what he calls using NAFTA for reform. NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement. And if you are receiving the Outlook magazine that we send out to those of you that donate to Point of View, you notice that I do spend a little bit of time in my article talking about what can be done through NAFTA, but I was talking about it in terms of how we could revise that in terms of trade. But Ted Cruz comes up with another idea, and that is he's proposed to the president, that is President Donald Trump, using NAFTA as a vehicle for regulatory reform. in which you could actually lift some of the burdens on those things which are killing jobs. And under NAFTA, which is a trade promotion authority, Congress only has to come up with 50 votes. So it's an expedited up or down vote, and so that cannot be filibustered. So here is, again, an individual starting to learn the parliamentary procedures to begin to work around a filibuster. And so that is the fourth article we've posted on our website today. First article is, of course, about the interview that I did with Kyle Mann about how to be a perfect Christian, some of the work being done there by Babylon B. Then we did the interview with Kristina Rasmussen on welfare reform. Also have the article there about food stamp reform. The third article there is, of course, the one that we discussed with Stephen Moore about goodbye OPEC. And as he points out, OPEC really doesn't exist anymore. It's primarily Saudi Arabia, and we are becoming the beneficiary of some of the oil exploration and shale oil development that is taking place, and getting to the point where we might be energy independent and maybe even energy dominant. And then this piece here on beating the filibuster, Ted Cruz, 4 ways to work around a filibuster. So some great material coming there as well on the website, pointofview.net. And as I mentioned, tomorrow we'll spend a little bit of time talking about some of the accomplishments under this president. The reason that Robert Knight decided to write that is he said, I'm told by one of my favorite millennials that many of her friends have not heard anything at all positive about President Trump. So we'll spend a little bit of time getting into that, maybe in the second hour, and I'll cover some of that even in our local program. And then we'll get into the subject of Israel. What is the significance of 70 years since the establishment of the Jewish state? And in between those two pieces, we'll spend some time talking about what happens after we die, a very, very powerful and profound conversation that I know we'll have with Randy Frazee, who is the co-teacher with Max Lucado. By the way, I might just mention Max Lucado is going to be in studio with us next week, so it'll be fun to chat with him about his new book as well. All this information available on our website, pointofview.net. If you find yourself saying, I hear what you have to say, I'd like to read it for myself, I'd like to photocopy it, maybe pass it on to friends, or I really need to check out some of the facts and figures you've been mentioning here so that I can see whether or not you're telling the truth. That's why we provide that information on the website, pointofview.net, and I would encourage you to get that. My commentary today, More God, Less Crime. Great material that has come from this new book, which we've talked about before, from Byron Johnson, who is a professor at Baylor University. And that book is a reminder that if we really want to solve the issue of crime and recidivism, faith-based organizations are going to be most effective. And that is something that President Trump just signed into law as an executive order the other day at the National Day of Prayer. So we've certainly covered a lot of topics, and we'll cover a whole lot more tomorrow here on Point of View. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Visit the website, pointofview.net. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of